Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment it's time to raise your voice because the Bellas are back in Pitch Perfect 3. The members of the a cappella group The Bellas are having a hard time adjusting to post-college life, with Becca, played by Anna Kendrick, walking away from her job as a music producer. At a reunion, Aubrey, played by Anna Camp, suggests that through her father they can entertain the troops on an international USO tour and go on one final trip together. There, the Bellas must compete against rival bands with instruments, including Evermoist, fronted by Ruby Rose's Calamity, to become the opening act for DJ Khaled, playing himself, and a secret from the past of Fat Amy, played by Rebel Wilson, potentially threatens the Bellas. The original Pitch Perfect was a surprise hit in 2012. It wasn't really for me. I thought it was perfectly fine, but I'm not the target audience, and I think for those people it really struck a chord. I think audiences really related and resonated with this tale of misfits and outcasts that make up the Bellas, and especially enjoyed the a cappella element. The song covers and the singing are a huge reason for Pitch Perfect's success, and if you want proof of that, look at Anna Kendrick's cover of Cups, which entered into the Billboard Top 100, which just goes to show how popular these films are. It's one of the few series that's anchored by women, both in front and behind the camera. Kay Cannon has wrote all three films, and Elizabeth Banks, who co-stars in all of these movies, also produced all three of them, and she stepped into the director's chair for the sequel. That 2015 sequel, incidentally, I thought was weaker than the first film. It's very much got the usual problems of a comedy sequel. It feels very self-indulgent and baggy, but in spite of those issues, it still made a huge amount of money. It's actually the highest grossing musical comedy at the box office, surpassing School of Rock. So obviously a third film was inevitable, but alas, this is an encore too many. It's clear from the earlier scenes of Pitch Perfect 3 they've really exhausted everything that they could possibly do with these characters. They'd already graduated college by the time the second film ended, and when we pick up with them, it's a couple of years later, but honestly, it doesn't seem like things have changed very much since graduation. They're all struggling to get jobs, they're all struggling to integrate themselves in the real world, and they're all pining for their glory days in the Bellas, and that is a bad note to start this movie off to begin with, because there's no character growth whatsoever between films. In some cases, characters have actually regressed substantially, and I'm looking at Becca, who spent the entire second movie fighting for a prestigious music producer job. She starts this movie by walking out of it. There's a scene where she's cleaning up a track for some stupid hip-hop group with a misogynistic song, and she storms out because she's got integrity. Okay, you're throwing away this incredibly high-powered, potentially prestigious job because of this? Really? You can tell that the movie feels very forced and contrived. They need to bring away to get these characters back together, but it undermines them substantially. I wanted to see these characters in far different positions than how we left them at the end of the last movie. With the exception of one character who happens to be pregnant and therefore gets written out almost instantly, none of them have changed one iota between films. The first section of the movie is by far the most that seems like the Pitch Perfect films, because it's setting up all the plot elements, and it's basically following the formula of the series to this point, in that we have them getting involved in some kind of tour, and there's a rival group, and there's some sort of tournament element. That rival group is a band called Evermoist, which is led by Ruby Rose's Calamity. First of all, the only reason the band is called Evermoist, which is a terrible name, is so that we can give Rebel Wilson a whole bunch of easy vaginal jokes to make. Who would ever call their band Evermoist. And they set up this with a fairly lengthy scene where they do another riff-off. If you're familiar with the riff-off scenes from the previous movies, especially in the second one, it's basically a 7 or 8 minute scene going through multiple song covers in very quick succession and linking and bouncing off of each other. There are 2 other bands in this tournament, by the way, and I barely even need to mention them because they hardly show up through the rest of the movie at all. They're set up and dropped just as quickly. And believe me, that's a pattern that follows all the way through the rest of Pitch Perfect 3. And this riff-off sequence is the closest the film gets to recapturing the spark of the earlier entries. And even then, it feels like an inferior copy, especially because the categories in this part are bizarre, like people you didn't know were Jewish, or my personal favourite, zombie apocalypse. Are there that many songs about that subject? Nevertheless, there is a grain of an interesting setup here. There is a clear natural progression that you see across sequels, and I was interested to see how the Bellas would adapt their technique and, find themselves on equal footing with a full-fledged band. And really, the answer is they don't. About halfway through the movie, you can very much pinpoint the exact moment where it seems like everyone involved with the movie just stopped caring about this whole plot that they've been setting up for the whole first half of the movie. Ruby Rose is completely wasted in this film. She spends the first half of it doing mean girl shtick, and then she virtually disappears. The Bellas, who were previously established as constantly screwing up, to suddenly being the most popular band on the tour and everyone loves them, the movie just suddenly loses interest in its own story. And that really says a lot, because if the film isn't interested in it, then why should I be? And I think even the filmmakers were aware that this really wasn't working this time out, because this shows clear signs of something that's been reworked in post to try and get some laughs out of it. If you've seen the trailer, you'll no doubt know that the early going of the movie is meant to incorporate this mockumentary element, because the commentators from the previous films, played by John Michael Higgins and Elizabeth Banks, they're shooting a documentary about the Bellas and how they're getting on after college. This really doesn't make any sense to begin with, because they're just forcing these characters down our throats. In the first Pitch Perfect, they only appeared in the competition scenes, which made sense, because they're commentators. And yet here, they're thrust into events where they have no reason to be here whatsoever. None. They just suddenly pop up every so often. And what is with their fixation with the Bellas? Why are they so especially gravitating towards them that they're going around essentially stalking them? And it's not funny in the slightest. And it's obvious that this went down like a lead balloon, because most of it has been jettisoned from the final version of the film, but they couldn't delete it entirely because, there was obvious references to it, so they've had to keep some of it, and what you end up with is, again, a subplot that phases in and out of the movie occasionally when the narrative needs it. There are other moments where it seems like footage that was shot for this chunk of the movie has been badly repurposed. There's a scene where the Bellas have all got back together, and someone asks Becca, "Oh, how are the Bellas doing?" And suddenly there's this random flashback that is clearly scenes that they shot for the documentary chunk of the movie that has all been turned into this vignetted, yellow filtered montage, and it has characters speaking to the camera. It makes no sense. If you're gonna junk this stuff, just straight out junk it. And later on in the end credits, there's more footage There's some outtakes, there's some behind the scenes stuff, and there's obviously deleted scenes footage playing all throughout the credits. And I think the reason why the movie abandons so much of the plotting that it sets up is because they just threw it on the cutting room floor, and so suddenly the midsection of the movie turns into constant montages. Things aren't successful, so we're just going to chop up whole sequences and just turn them into montages, just constantly all the way through. There's obviously like a good 15 minutes of the film that were just sucked right out of the middle. And the characters have so much less to do this time out. Anna Kendrick's Becca, she's got this main plot where DJ Khaled takes a shine to her and makes her an offer where she has to decide whether she's going to stay with the Bellas or go out and spread her wings on her own. This subplot is really unengaging. It feels like a warmed over version of what she'd already had to address in the second and the first movie. It's not hugely enthralling, and it doesn't help that DJ Khaled is pretty wooden playing himself. There's a couple of moments where they try to give him comedy bits, and it's awkward and uncomfortable. His extended guest appearance, he's a fairly prominent supporting player in this. His appearance is basically there so everyone can talk about how cool he is and how great his music is constantly. And if that wasn't vaguely humorous enough, there's also the fact that every so often in the concert scenes, they'll do cutaways to Khaled listening and going, that's good music. Like, just nodding his head in approval every so often. Nodding shot. And the Bellas are so underutilised in this outing. It's very obvious that the performers on screen have a very strong chemistry with each other, but the film doesn't utilise it at all. And many of them are still trotting out the same jokes they had in the first movie, and in some cases, not even that. Poor Hailee Steinfeld. Her character was introduced in the second film as someone who wanted to be an aspiring songwriter. She wants to do original tunes for herself, and yet, in this movie, she actually says at one point that she's not written anything since the events of that movie. Well, way to undermine that characterisation. And there were things that did make me laugh on occasion, I will say that. The character of Lily, who quietly mutters vaguely sadistic, uncomfortable things under her breath. That joke still worked for me, partially because they gave her this little romantic subplot going on through the movie that's kind of weird and a little bit gross. But most of the jokes that I laughed at in this film were of the self-depreciating variety. It seems like Pitch Perfect 3 is aware of its own faults and shortcomings, and they try to lampshade it, but mostly it just ends up with me laughing derisively at just the inherent problems that they just haven't bothered to address. They just make fun of them. So there are two members of the Bellas that are so peripheral, they actually call attention to that fact on several occasions, the fact that these characters just hang around and barely have lines. But then the movie suddenly takes a bewildering turn, but not completely out of left field, because this entry starts in media res, because it starts out with a big action set piece culminating in an explosion, and the title suddenly slams on screen over a freeze frame, and you just go to yourself, wait, what? And it's clear that from watching so many bad movies that have attempted this, that they've stapled this on as a cold open to shock the audience of, oh, how did the characters end up in this situation? And it's basically a tacit acknowledgement that, yeah, the preceding material really isn't necessary to understand what's happening here. Is certainly far less engaging, and having sat through an hour of the film to get back to where this opened, I can vouch for the fact that yes, none of the preceding material is as morbidly fascinating as what happens towards the third act of this film. This subplot with Fat Amy starts emerging roughly around the halfway point. She has apparently been on the run from her father, who is played by John Lithgow, and he has this comedy Australian accent, or at least I hope it's a comedy Australian accent, because it sounds like he's wandered out of Bart versus Australia, that episode of The Simpsons. It is a staggeringly awful accent. But he tries to work his way back into Amy's life, and it's clear that he is some sort of criminal mastermind. I shall repeat that. The Bellas end up facing off against a member of the criminal underworld, who happens to be Fat Amy's father. This really doesn't have anything to do with the singing or the competition element. Suddenly, it seems like the writer went, well, let's just throw all credibility out the window whatsoever. How about we turn this into a ucker action flick? So if you've ever had a burning desire to see Rebel Wilson in several fight sequences, complete with speed ramping, well, this is the movie for you, I guess. I'm not sure what this has to do with the main premise. It just feels like they just went completely wild because, hey, it's the final movie and we're so out of material that we're just gonna suddenly just change genres, because that's always a mark of a great sequel. It's always a great thing when I say, you know what, this is the Hangover 3 of Pitch Perfect movies. And it's a pretty accurate comparison because it's an obvious example of a breakout supporting character in the case of Fat Amy, who suddenly gets thrust into the limelight. She is effectively the main character because this takes up so much of the running time. And it's so catastrophically ill-judged. By placing that character at the forefront, everything suddenly becomes far less interesting, and that character is far less funny because it massively exposes that there is only so much that you can do with that sort of player, because she's mostly a reactive character. She shouldn't be the primary driving force of the plot, and certainly shouldn't be hijacking the movie. What happened to this series? You watch this play out on screen and you just go, how did we even get here? It's a sign of a series that is just completely lost. If you're a fan of this series, Pitch Perfect 3 is a disappointment, especially given that this is meant to cap off the franchise. This is meant to be the big finale that sends everyone off on an emotional note. There's several moments in this film where they establish that this really is the final one. There are moments where they look at each other and realise, yeah, this is the final tour. And then the movie will do something like their last proper performance together, not the one that happens towards the end of the film, which is very much impromptu. That happens off screen. It happens largely in a montage. That undermines the supposed emotion that the film is building up. For everyone else, it's a wild misfire where you just are staggered at just how bereft they are of ideas by this point, and the sheer desperation that is especially apparent in the second half of the film. I have genuinely rarely seen a sequel that so completely misses the point of why people like the first one. Pitch Perfect 3 shows a series that is straining to do anything new, and in doing so loses sight of what made the original so popular. It goes through the motions of previous Pitch Perfect films, setting up a new conflict and set of antagonists, but it has no interest in it, discarding that plot and those characters midway through, with far less the a cappella song covers that are the most enjoyable sequences of these films. Instead, it gets increasingly derailed by the plot with Fat Amy's father, ultimately and inexplicably becoming a Rebel Wilson action film that seems an absolute world away from the original. There's a few chuckles, but this disjointed, obviously re-edited finale will come as a disappointment to fans of the series and sends it out on a low note. If you like this review, then make some noise over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.